This interview is with Father McGinnity, the spiritual director of Christina Gallagher, on Friday evening, June 23rd, at the opening of the House of Prayer in Leander, Texas, located just outside of the city of Austin. We will briefly touch on several topics, barely covering the wealth of information of the knowledge and wisdom, the prophecies and events surrounding Christina Gallagher. I would urge you to pick up the book mentioned in our talk, or there's a lot of other information which you can find online or in other videos on Christina. Tonight, we will look into the history of Christina Gallagher, the prophet of God, called in her youth, and then as a young adult, her mission began. And Father will describe her mission and what she's trying to do. We'll talk about the House of Prayer in Ireland, the inception, its purpose, and its role in God's plan. Father will talk about our mother's call for a chain of houses, for the special graces and protection, and for the 3 promises for them. We'll look into some of the healings as one of the ways which God has upheld Christina Gallagher. We will talk about her prophecies that have come true and the ones that are still to come. There is one that we didn't discuss, which involved the image of Our Lady, the Queen of Peace, which you saw at the beginning of the video. A man from Sri Lanka came to the House of Prayer about 2 months before the tsunami. And when he heard of Christina's prophecy about the tsunami, he bought 500 copies to take home with him. He distributed them to all of his friends and family and the people that he knew. And he gave 1 copy to the U.S. consulate, and they put it in the corner. 2 months later, the tsunami hit. And all of the houses that had a copy of the image that he had brought back from the House of Prayer, none of them were damaged at all. And when he went to the U.S. consulate, they now had the picture on the wall in a frame. So, let's listen to Father talk about Christina Gallagher. And so, Father, why don't you just sort of set the stage for us here and talk about Christina as a young child, the first apparitions or conversations that she had when she was really sick, and then go into her first meeting as an adult with Jesus, like you were telling me just a little bit ago.
Yes, when she was very, very young, she was extremely ill, and she was conscious in that experience that she was going to die. And in fact, her parents were greatly alarmed because in fact they thought she had died at a certain moment. Her breathing stopped and she was aware of the panic around her. And at that time she had an experience of God the Father, and she begged in that experience to be allowed to live. And all she heard at that time was, "So be it." And she didn't understand what the words meant, but inwardly she grasped it must mean that I'm getting what I'm asking. And that was the end of that. She did recover against all expectations at the time, and she grew up. But it was in 1985 that she had her first experience of Jesus in his passion. She saw, but didn't hear anything. She saw Jesus crowned with thorns, suffering in his passion. And at that time she was given a very profound awareness of sin, and she's always been a good living person and practicing Catholic, but at that time she got a very, very profound awareness that sin is the cause of what is brought upon our Lord, and she was overtaken by a desire to comfort Jesus, to console him because of the sin of the world and her own personal weakness and so on. And that was in 1985. And for the next 3 years before Our Lady would appear to her in 1988, as it happened, she didn't have any other apparitions, but she was drawn very deeply into union with Jesus through the Spirit. For example, she commenced going to daily Mass. She would always have been at Sunday Mass, but and after Holy Communion especially, she was experiencing very, very deeply the love of God, and she was receiving enormous gifts of prayer, but very rare and special gifts, because it was evident subsequently that she was being given mystical experiences, and she was sometimes praising God in her prayer after Mass in languages that she didn't understand and of course had never learned. And eventually I asked her to tape these prayers, and it turned out that we had them translated into Arabic. She was speaking Arabic, she was speaking Greek, she was speaking Latin, and the content or sentiments of the prayers were sometimes glorifying the Blessed Trinity, sometimes articulating in another language unknown to her Our Father, and generally praising God. But in 1988, in the month of January, she had her first apparition of Our Blessed Lady. She wasn't expecting. In fact, she was visiting a friend in Dublin, and they were just sitting chatting about some everyday thing, and the next moment this apparition occurred, and Our Blessed Mother came out of this enormous light, and yet at the same time she was radiating light. And she said, I am the Virgin Mary, Queen of Peace, and I come in peace. And this peace radiated from her and put Christine at ease, and that was the beginning of the apparitions. And they began and continued then more frequently at that time than they occur now. But during 1988, 1989, 1990, Our Lady conveyed the essence of her message, which is to Christina, and through Christina, a call to conversion. Please come back to me and my son, were her early words. We are waiting. Some of our children think they do not know the way back. I say, just take the first step and I will help you. And it was a message of encouragement to come back to God, and it was a message that summoned us to the sacraments. Our Lady said, unburden yourselves of all sin in the sacrament of confession and receive my son's body and blood worthily in Holy Communion. The Mass is wonderful, but more people need to go to confession. And she gradually led in her messages to a call for prayer, and particularly outside the Mass, the Rosary. But she taught Christina to say the Rosary more slowly than she had been used to do. And Our Lady explained that to pray from the heart as she desired, one needs to know what one is saying and the person to whom one is saying it. And she taught Christina very beautifully, but very simply, that a prayer of the heart means that the heart opens to God in love, and we love Our Lady or God through the words that we utter, and that in this opening of the heart is able to receive in return the graces that flow from the Rosary in such abundance, but that these graces are sadly lost when people don't think of what they're saying, when they rhyme off the words, when they rush through the prayer, or when they have no love in their hearts. And Our Lady actually said that when the rosary is prayed from the heart with love, in a conversation of love with her, then we can obtain anything we ask. And it was at that time that a man who had cancer of the tongue and the mouth heard of Our Lady's call through Christina, and began praying the rosary. Our Lady requested the full rosary each day, and when she says a rosary, she means the joyful, sorrowful and glorious mysteries. The luminous mysteries had not been given by Pope John Paul II at that time, but a rosary was the full rosary, and this man began with his wife to pray each day the rosary. He also requested a matrix medal. I should explain that that is a medal Our Lady asked Christina to have struck for conversion and protection, and through it many miracles have occurred through its use throughout the world. And this man used to touch the cancer with the medal, and he would pray the rosary slowly from the heart with his wife each day, and he was due to have part of his tongue removed in surgery and part of the floor of his mouth, and to have grafts from his arm to his mouth. And when he went for the actual operation, the biopsies had been taken and shown the cancer, and he had been unable to eat solid food for weeks and weeks. They told him he was completely healed, and they couldn't explain it, and he could eat again and so on. But that was the way Our Lady taught the rosary. So she was summoning us to the sacraments, to greater reverence for Holy Communion, and she was asking for the rosary, but from the heart. And
now, one thing when you talk about reverence, I know other people have mentioned this, and I've heard it from you too, about taking the rosary, or taking the Eucharist on the tongue. Maybe you could get into that just a little bit?
Yeah. Our Blessed Mother asked for reparation for the abuse of Holy Communion. And she clearly had in mind, because she emphasized confession, that many people were approaching the Holy Sacrament without the proper inner dispositions. And she invited us to make reparation. She invited us to choose to receive Holy Communion in an act of reparation, humbly on the tongue, but at no point, and I emphasize this, did Our Blessed Lady ever obligate people to do it. She didn't insist that it be done de rigueur. She asked for it as an act of reparation. She didn't come into conflict with the Church or with the available permission to receive on the tongue. She clearly understood, as we know from the papal documents in this regard, that a person is free to choose to receive on the tongue, and Our Lady invited people to make that choice. Now, people are free to make the reparation or not.
Okay. And now, in this beginning period, did she have any locutions at all? Or have all of her communications been where she's seeing something?
All of her communications have not been exclusively seeing. I would make the distinction in what happens to Christina between apparitions, visions. Sometimes people use apparition and vision coterminously. They're not strictly coterminous. An apparition is an experience in which a heavenly person, such as Christ, our Blessed Mother, an angel, a saint, comes, and they are present three-dimensionally. They are present as you are before me now, and there's no difference between what I see in the reality of you before me and in the way the visionary will perceive the heavenly personage. And in some such situations, within the experience, touch can occur. But Christina would use the word vision for a different experience in, for example, the moments when she has often been shown as in what we would compare it to a television sequence, where, for example, she would find herself looking on at a war that's going to take place. Or this occurred actually when years before it happened, she was shown the war in Chechnya under Boris Yeltsin, when they attempted to make a breakaway within the Soviet Union in Chechnya. And she could actually see it taking place as if it were brought forward to now. And that vision experience has also been used frequently to Christina by heaven, for example, showing the storms that will occur. For example, not many weeks back, the Danube in Europe overflowed its banks, and when it was being shown on the television news, there was in one instance a close-up of an entire bank coming away from the land and being swept downstream. And Christina got quite excited when that occurred on the screen, because she said, I was shown that exact event. And then she went on to talk about future events, they're not too far away, in which she was clearly told in one of the messages that in a tsunami experience, portions of countries will be drawn into the ocean, but she made the distinction that it won't be like what happened with the Danube River. What will take place is there will be a vacuum, as it were, or a suction at work through the movement of the ocean, and it will actually draw the land down into the sea. In other words, it won't be as if the ground has been simply dislodged by the strength of the current of water. There will be something more powerful at work, and of course more frightening at work, and involving much vaster portions of the earth. And so this vision, as she would describe it, is where she might as well be present at what is going to occur, or it works retrospectively too. She, in the early stages more than now, she might as well have been walking around Galilee with the disciples in the company of our Lord, and she witnessed Jesus giving additional instruction to the disciples apart from his public discourses and what is recorded in the gospel, but always explanatory of the content of what he would have said publicly, where the apostles would be able to question him, and more especially where she would experience the testing that our Lord endured at the apostles' inability to grasp and understand what he was trying to say to them, and of how Jesus would be anguished in spirit, wondering, how much longer do I have to put up with you? You don't seem to grasp what I'm trying to put across, and how it would weary him. But there's always a purpose for which she's given everything, and sometimes not at that moment, but slightly later it will become evident. And I have noticed that in Christina's own experience, she gets wearied and anguished too at so many people who don't seem to grasp or want to grasp the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves, and to, with an open heart, accept and receive the teaching, which is nothing new, of course, because when the Archdiocese examined the content of what Christina has received, they found that it is in perfect harmony with the truth of the Scriptures and the teaching of the Church.
Okay, one thing before we get back into the visions and stuff. Now, do these visions come like in dreams, or is she in a waking state?
Yeah. In Christina's case, I know that in the lives of some saints, for example, Mother Cabrini, known in the United States here, it would happen to her in dreams. Not with Christina. Occasionally, very, very occasionally, and generally not to do with some central revelation. Christina would also have some experience in dreams, and it would then happen, but and in the life of St. Patrick, it was dreams that God used to communicate to him regarding his mission. Not so with Christina. For the most part, for the overwhelming part of her experience, she's always in the waking state.
Now, in prayer, or can this happen just almost
Yes.
in any?
This can happen at any time. She, in the beginning, she had some experiences during Holy Mass, sometimes during the Rosary, but no, for the majority of her experiences, it will be when she's least expecting it, and when she's not explicitly engaged in something prayerful. The messages for the public days at the House of Prayer in the month of July, there are two central days: the anniversary of the opening of the House of Prayer, which heaven desired for priests and people, and that House of Prayer is very, very special. Our Lady promised to be present in it with many angels. She always communicates a message for that anniversary each year, the 16th of July, and also for the day that she has now also elevated as a day of special significance, and that's the 25th of July each year. But the message Our Lady gives for each of those days is given. It mightn't be always appreciated by people, but Christina has found that that message will be given at the moment when she least expects it, and there's a reason for that which maybe it's not necessary to get into, but she was made aware that it's always done by our Blessed Mother at the moment that the evil one least expects it too, so that it's totally protected from heaven. And for example, she can sometimes be awakened in the middle of the night to receive that message, and some others as well.
Okay, so then she really doesn't like go into an ecstasy then? I mean,
she doesn't go into an ecstasy generally. When a message is being communicated, it would be quite normal for her to hear our Blessed Mother speak to her, and for her to be perhaps in the company of, well, someone close involved in the work, or someone like myself, though generally it takes place when she's on her own. Mm-hmm. But she could still receive the message and dictate it, so that the person near her could write it down, and she would be, and I had that very privileged experience on a number of occasions where I would be present, as it might happen, and others perhaps too, but heaven would communicate with her. And as happened to me in the first such experience I had, meeting Christina, I had something in my mind which I had not articulated, but which I had thought I'd like to ask our Blessed Mother. And the next moment, instantly, our Blessed Mother gave Christina the answer to what I was wondering and thinking, but I hadn't even said it to Christina.
Oh, wow. Now, one thing I remember reading about, you went into that Christina has received a ring from Jesus.
Yes, he placed a ring on her finger, a Blessed Mother. Christina didn't understand anything of the history of this in the mysticism of the church. It has happened to great...
Well, you mentioned like over 70.
Well, there are just over 20 recorded cases.
20 recorded?
Yeah, that's all. And it's known as the mystical marriage. Of course, it can happen because it's a spiritual communication and has to do with the relationship of Christ to the soul. It could happen to a man as well as to a woman in that sense, because St. John of the Cross actually speaks of it without reference to gender. But I wasn't aware of any of that at the time because all of this came very new to me. I had to deal with the experiences as they were occurring to Christina. Yes, he placed a ring upon her finger and he told her that it would become visible to her at certain moments of her life when her trials would be greatest. And she saw a stone in the ring, and Jesus told her that other stones would come upon it, but only after she had endured the experiences that lay ahead of her in her life for him.
Now, do you know how many stones then?
I don't know, quite frankly, at the end, how many it will be.
Okay. And one more thing before we get going. How did you become involved with Christina? We need to touch on that.
Yeah. In the very, very beginning, when Christina had her first experience of Jesus in his passion, which I mentioned earlier, there was a nun present, a religious sister, a sister of mercy, and she was very helpful to Christina, and Christina, of course, hadn't a clue about any of this that was happening to her, and the nun was particularly supportive. And after a while, the nun, not Christina, the nun contacted myself. And how did she know about me? Because I live at the other end of the country. Christina lives in the extreme west of Ireland. I live at the extreme east of the country. And this particular nun had heard about me. I used to give a lot of retreats, and I used to preach quite a bit concerning our Blessed Mother. And she said to Christina, you know, you'd better get a spiritual director, you know, in the church. You know, if anything special like that is happening, you know, you've got to have a spiritual director. And Christina wasn't aware of any of that. And then the nun sent in writing to me an account of the various experiences that Christina had had. And she continued to do so even though I had never yet met Christina. And I didn't meet her actually for many, many months after that first began. And on the occasion when I did first come into her company, there were other people present. I remember it was at her home. And after we were all greeting each other and talking generally and chatting, the others left the room and I was alone with Christina. And that was the time when I was present for the first time when our Blessed Mother appeared to her. And on that occasion she showed Christina a number of things that were going to happen to me. Clearly it was a sign for me, although I didn't ask for a sign. And Christina mentioned these things, and they all happened exactly as our Blessed Mother said. And in addition, my sister-in-law, my older brother's wife, got cancer of the gallbladder, and it had spread within her abdomen to other organs, and her face went sallow and jaundiced looking and dark around her eyes, and her doctor told her that she'd have to have immediate surgery. And I called Christina at the time and I said, you know, we've got terribly bad news. My sister-in-law seems to be very far gone with cancer, and will you pray for her? And Christina said, I will pray, but as you speak to me now, and this is another gift that she was given in addition to the apparition, the vision, the locutions, which I didn't go into, but the locutions are sometimes the way in which a message is conveyed, as we did speak about earlier. But in addition, Christina is given to know reality elsewhere, or the depth of some reality. And this happened in the case of my sister-in-law's cancer. She said, as you're speaking to me, I can see the extent of the cancer within her, and I can tell you it's hopeless. It is humanly hopeless. But I will pray. I will pray. So the next time our Blessed Mother appeared to her, she said to our Blessed Mother, Holy Mother, you're pleased that Father is spreading your message. And Our Lady smiled. And Christina then said, because as a person she's very direct and sometimes very blunt, but that's her nature and that's the way God has chosen her. And she communicates with Our Lady always respectfully, but very directly. And she just said to our Blessed Mother, Holy Mother, if you're so pleased with him, now is the time to show it. Because his sister-in-law is hopelessly ill. And our Blessed Mother said to Christina, my child, you do not know what you ask. You do not know how God will indeed be glorified in this. But she didn't explain anything further, and Christina was as wise as ever, but she told it to me afterwards. Anyway, my sister-in-law was marked for a colostomy, when the bladder would be removed. She was rushed into hospital. She was told she would have chemotherapy afterwards and so on. When she was wakened up after the surgery in the hospital, a nurse came to her bed and said, how are you feeling, Mrs. McGinnity? You know, the surgeon is baffled because although he searched everywhere in the operation and I was present during her surgery, he could find no cancer, and her complexion was perfect, and it had shown up in the blood tests and in the scans before, as well as in her appearance. And she said, of course you're not going to have any colostomy and you won't have any chemotherapy. And she was discharged right away. And later, I remember so well, and it was a locution this time, when our Blessed Mother next spoke to Christina, Christina thanked Our Lady. And our Blessed Mother just said, well, you did ask me for a sign for your spiritual director. I am giving many signs and they are not being noticed.
Yeah, that's clearly going on everywhere. Let's talk a little bit about the stigmata. I've seen the picture of the wounds in the feet and also the crown of thorns.
That's right. Yes, the wounds in the feet which you've seen, that occurred during Lent in the house of prayer, was witnessed by between 100 and 200 people during an all-night vigil. And in fact, all of those people wrote their testimonies and sent them to the Archbishop. And what occurred was that these wounds burst open, they just opened. The blood flowed over her feet and would not, however, run onto the ground for some strange reason. The blood exuded a fragrance which was beautiful. It was, I don't know how you would describe it, a bit like the perfume of roses. And before it occurred, Christine had no idea. She was as shocked as other people, although that day she was going through enormous inner anguish, but she had no conception that such a thing would happen. The crowning with thorns, those wounds occurred on a couple of occasions. For example, there was one day when she woke up in the morning and she had washed her face, she noticed blood on the towel. And when she looked in the mirror, she saw these 5 wounds on her forehead. They were quite large wounds. And again, she was shocked. She didn't have any idea this was going to occur. But the interesting thing in regard to how these events are always interrelated, they're always part of the overall message of our Blessed Mother, I have found, and I'll explain that further in a moment. But later that day, 5 priests came in a group to see Christina. This was in the very beginning, and they had never met her before, and she received them as a group. And as they came, and she looked at each one, and this brings us back to the gift I mentioned just a moment ago. She was aware of the hidden life of each priest as she looked at him, though she had never met any of them before. And she spoke to each of them in turn, and as she did, each priest was amazed that she could know them so intimately. And in the case of one, the youngest, she not only was able to describe him to himself, but she told him where his bishop would shortly appoint him. And this occurred, of course, even though she didn't know the bishop or the diocese or anything. And one of the priests, a very sharp, intellectual sort of man who had headed a huge school and used to write letters to the newspaper and so on, he came disbelieving, very skeptical rather, and as Christina shook hands with each, she looked into his face and she said, "You're skeptical, you don't believe." And he was shocked that she should say this in front of the others. And then she started to tell him about himself, and he was converted. And the others on the way home, because one of them talked to me afterwards, they were joking with him because they said, "Oh, she really summed you up." Well, because they knew him intimately. Right. But so, you know, sometimes people focus on the special gifts that Christina has, such as this knowledge of soul, and it's exactly the knowledge that Padre Pio was given. I mean, he could tell people their sins, as we all know, before they confess them, and it's the same with Christina, but she handles it very compassionately, very gently. She is never judgmental. In fact, if anything, the gift makes her so tender-hearted. It's as if the merciful heart of Jesus comes through her to the priest or to the person. And I mean, she talks about many such situations, and I have witnessed them myself when I've been at the House of Prayer, or even accompanying her when she travelled around the world at one point in 92 when we were invited to so many places, but the priests would be lining up to meet her, but they would be coming from her in tears, and some of the priests would say, "It's all right, you can stay there," and I would be present when, she would be telling them some very intimate things, and they would just burst into tears, and they would be so grateful and so reassured that God knew everything, even the depths of such weakness, because she would always be consoling them and getting them to trust and to accept their weakness in order to deal with it and to rise above it, and with God's help to know that it could be overcome and healed. And every priest she meets, she suffers more because she carries that priest and his needs, and she endures for their healing. In fact, one young priest had decided to leave the ministry completely, and he had told everyone, and he was brought to the house of prayer by some lay people, and the organizer begged Christina to please give him 10 minutes, and she did. And he came out from meeting Christina, and it was like a great burden was lifted from him, and he was saying to Pia, "I'm not leaving the priesthood." It was wonderful.
Before we get off the thing on the priests, one thing I think that you brought up in the weakness is something that Paul brought up, and I think how God likes to use everyone, it's through our weaknesses, so that all glory goes to God. And but with the suffering and stuff, I know the bulk of the suffering isn't outwardly visible, and tell people about, because Christina is a victim soul for priests.
Yes. The key to that goes back almost to the beginning, and the way in which Jesus put it is very interesting. He requested of Christina permission to suffer within her. He requested permission to suffer within her for priests, his brother priests as he called it, and then for souls. And he said to Christina, "Some of my brother priests lack the courage to speak up for my true teaching." And he gave her to understand the two weapons used by Satan against priests at the present time to intimidate them from proclaiming truth. And these weapons are pride and fear. Pride, so that they don't come across to the colleagues, to their brother priests, to their peers, as being conservative or out of date or not with it. And this is used in order to suppress their freedom to proclaim the fullness of truth. And pride and fear, likewise fear that they will not be popular with people who want to hear something more progressive or liberal than the fullness of the truth. But the strange thing is that the truth is what people actually are yearning for, and the priests in those situations are being deceived by this temptation, because they would have inner peace if they could trust, and Christina emphasizes this so often, that truth will uphold itself. Because Jesus is truth, Jesus will uphold the truth, and we should never be afraid that we will be dismissed or we will be cast aside or rejected because our message is unpopular. Jesus is the truth, and the truth cannot be improved upon or changed. And she suffers for priests because of their lack of courage to speak up for the true teaching of Jesus. But she's a victim not just for priests, she's a victim for souls. And she suffers in many ways. I remember in the early stages of the apparitions, Christina telling me that at that time there were 3 different forms of suffering that she was enduring, and they were inner forms of suffering. But she said, I can always know when, because the suffering is different, when it is for the healing of an illness or a disease like cancer. And by the way, cancer is the most frequently healed condition at the House of Prayer and through the mission of Christina. But again, like the stigmata, it is inherently linked with the message, because in the beginning, when Christina was praying for a cancer victim to Our Blessed Lady, and Our Blessed Lady had appeared to her, Our Lady said, it is the cancer of the soul that I desire to heal. So Our Lady was explaining that we must come to recognize that sin is a cancer of the soul, and it is a more serious condition even than a physical disease, horrific as that may be, and much as we would wish our loved ones to be freed of physical disease. And perhaps I can only surmise that is the reason why so many instances of cancer have been verified medically and scientifically. In fact, in relation to one particular case, my own Archbishop, the Primate of all Ireland, declared that healing with its full medical file. 2 of the consultants were top level. One is a professor of medicine in Ireland. They proclaimed that that particular healing of a person with pancreatic cancer and secondaries in the bile duct was beyond medical, scientific or psychological explanation. And the Primate of all Ireland said that healing alone, but there were also others which he upheld in the same way, would be sufficient to beatify or canonize a saint. But to come back to how they are connected with the message, that is the cancer of the soul, and so many physical cancers are healed. I believe to draw attention to Our Lady's initial message that we must be freed of the disease of sin through coming back to the sacrament of penance, reconciliation, confession, call it what you will, and be reconciled to God. But the suffering, Christina said in the beginning that she would go through, made her aware that sometimes people were being healed of cancer, and she would say to me, I bet we'll hear within the next few days of a miraculous healing of cancer, because she was already enduring. She was conscious almost in the same sense in which our Lord in the Gospel said, power has gone out from me. Who touched me? It wouldn't be Christina's power, because she is none, and she always stresses she's not a healer. She cannot heal. In fact, she makes a joke about it. She says, if I had the power to heal, I would heal everybody. But I can only pray and suffer, but Jesus does the healing. But then the 2 other forms of suffering that she was aware of at that time indicated that someone was getting the gift of faith. She would suffer differently when someone who was disbelieving or skeptical actually was blessed with faith. And the 3rd form of suffering that she was conscious of at the beginning was for a priest being saved. A priest being saved. Now, I should explain that Christina went through a period of unmitigated suffering at a certain point in the very beginning of the apparitions, and during it she was given no consolation, and that is typical of the pattern whereby heaven works with her. She can be in desolation, which is yet another form of suffering which I'll come to in a moment, but she would not be given the comfort of knowing what God was doing with that particular stretch of suffering. But at the end of this particular period, our Blessed Mother showed her 3 priests. One she knew, she recognized, the other 2 were strangers. And our Blessed Mother said, through your most recent suffering, I have been able to protect these 3 of my priest sons. They would otherwise have left the priesthood and have lost their souls. Now that doesn't mean, I suppose, that everyone who leaves the priesthood loses his soul eternally, but in these particular cases, Our Lady made it clear from the simple words she uttered that for these particular priests it would have meant ultimate disaster. And so that form of suffering was different. But today Christina suffers in several ways. She doesn't like to give too much direct attention to the evil one, but one terrible form of suffering has been the afflictions such as St. John Vianney endured. And I suppose it's always a barometer to measure the degree to which the devil is furious with his loss of control through what she is prepared to endure for souls. And like St. John Vianney, though she wouldn't wish to be compared to such an exalted figure, she doesn't feel she's important, she doesn't feel she has anything to offer except what God manages to do through her. But she would have had to endure enormous tauntings. The devil tried different approaches with her. In the very beginning, he tried to win her over by being very attractive to her and by promising her anything in this world that she wanted. And when that failed, he turned very nasty and actually furious against her, and tried then to frighten her, tried to attack her in different ways. Now, I won't go into it in detail. I don't wish either to give undue importance to the evil one. Christina always stresses that he is darkness, he is the absence of light, that through trust and reliance in God, if a room is in darkness, it's like we can turn on the light. We shouldn't focus on the devil as such, but I have to say that he has tried every possible technique and method of undermining her courage, her resolve, her trust in God, and even her peace, to the extent of trying to deprive her of whole nights of sleep and disturbing her wherever he can.
Well, the one thing I think that is good about this talk like this is that there's a lot of people that I mean, because obviously the devil is attacking many people on different levels. And would you just go into a little bit about the subtlety? It's not like, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's not like he's not sitting there going, by the way, I'm the devil, and do it like this. I mean, isn't it more like just real subtle, these thoughts just come up?
Yes, that's
or
right.
Something like that?
That's right. He will, and I found it helpful. Christina wouldn't be aware of this because she never read a book in her life or studied anything, but in fact she couldn't read or write leaving school because of the amount of time she had missed looking after her mother, who had asthma, and Christina had to do the work at home. But personally, I found it helpful in directing Christina when I realized how Padre Pio suffered in this way as well. And Padre Pio frequently sought assurances from his spiritual director. Only relatively recently were his private letters to his spiritual director translated and published in languages other than Italian. Well, after the Italian version, the English followed quickly, but he thought, and it was the subtle temptation of the evil one, that he was going to go to hell himself, that he was displeasing to God, that he would say things like, please, I beg you, write back. He hadn't the advantage of a telephone. He had to wait for the time a letter would take to go and come back. But please, please, write back and tell me I'm not damned. And because I could see vestiges and echoes of that kind of thing now. With Christina, he wouldn't use the same words or whatever, but he would try, as I said earlier, to totally undermine her courage and her trust. And on one occasion, when he actually did make a burst into her experience, where she was permitted, as on some occasions she has been, to actually experience him fully, and he got into a rage with her because he couldn't seem to get what he wanted. He said, because she had been going through a lot of abandonment of soul, God doesn't want you, and I don't want you either. And he would call her, the depths of filthy names and expressions and vermin and so on. But anyway, no, she's been to hell and back, literally. She's experienced hell, but she couldn't have endured it if Jesus had not stayed at her side during it. And I'm quite sure that that she suffers for so many people who refuse to believe in hell and its existence, and likewise in the devil and his existence, and by that very token are unprotected in the face of his attacks and temptations, because they're not praying for grace, they're not seeking divine protection, they are by their disbelief rendering themselves vulnerable to his attacks.
Okay, let's move on back into the different visions she's had and stuff. And she was in New York for a talk or something in 1999?
Yeah, that's right. The occasion, which actually took place at Battery Park, down below the financial district in Manhattan, Christina receives many invitations, and she dislikes travel because she's uncomfortable flying. But the first time she was ever invited outside of Ireland was to a Marian conference in Pittsburgh, and she just was fluttering like a leaf on a tree. She dreaded the thought of being up in the air for so long. And yet Jesus said, "What matter if I bring you to the end of the earth so long as I am with you?" And she was made aware, she was shown a brief glimpse of purgatory and the souls that through her endurance of this experience of flying, which she feared, would be set free. So Jesus didn't take away the apprehension, but at that point he showed her how fruitful it would be for souls and reassured he would be with her. But she, afterwards, she would never decide really of herself whether to accept a particular invitation or not. And she would always pray about whether she should travel or not. And so she received this invitation in 1999, and she received it, I remember, in the month of June and the beginning of July. She was wondering about it. And I think it was on the 3rd of July that year when our Blessed Mother spoke to her and referred to it and said she desired her to go. And she made her aware that the organizer of the group, who was Filipino, was acting on heavenly inspiration, that this was a good thing. And so then Christina knew she had to go, she should go. And what they were organizing, incidentally, was a celebration of Our Lady's birthday with a regatta on the Hudson River, combined with a symposium of several talks, not maybe several, quite a few talks. And one of the speakers, they wished to be Christina from Ireland. And in this regatta, they wanted Our Lady under all her titles to be represented. And Christina was really the main speaker at that conference. But when we were there, we really understood some of the deep implications of why Our Lady desired her to go, because we were actually there on the 11th of September 1999, and on that very day Christina prophesied the destruction of the Twin Towers. And how it occurred was like this. The Marriott Hotel, where the speakers were hosted by the organizers, was actually right against the Twin Towers. And when we came out the door, a group of us, there was a Canadian attorney, and there was a retired American judge, Dan Lynch, and there was a reporter and other members of our group, including myself. And Dan Lynch gestured to the Twin Towers above us, towering majestically above us, and he remarked to Christina how this was such an enormous sign of prosperity and economic success. And Christina immediately shocked everybody, and she replied to Dan, she said, "No, Dan, these will crumble, these will fall if people do not turn back to God." And Judge Dan Lynch has his own website, and when the Twin Towers did unfortunately crumble on the 11th of September, 2 years later, Dan Lynch immediately called Ireland and spoke to Christina, and he said, "Do you remember your prophecy?" And he placed it on his website, and he called chat shows in Ireland and so on, and he gave his testimony to that. But there was a couple from Seattle, and they brought along their teenage boy who had a deep vein thrombosis, and they came to this event in Battery Park because they saw that Christina was going to be a speaker there, and they begged Christina to pray with their son. Jed Michael was the name, and he was in a very serious condition because this thrombosis was going up through his groin to the base of his stomach, and he actually had to wear very tight elastic wrapping and so on, and he was in great pain. And I remember he was brought to Christina in the foyer of the Marriott Hotel that I spoke of. And Christina put her hand on him and began to pray. And the moment she put her hand on him, she said, "You will never have pain again." And as she stresses herself so often, I could never say a thing like that of myself. I would never dare say a thing like that. And but she said it would always be only when the Holy Spirit would do that. And the wonderful thing is that as she prayed, all the pain left Jed Michael, and he said to his mother afterwards that he wanted to take this bandage, all this stuff off himself, because he felt different, and he was healed. And they later came actually to the House of Prayer in Ireland to give thanks, and they have come subsequently, especially for the month of July, to give public testimony. And he was completely healed, and actually his case was one of those presented, as I said earlier, to the Archbishop of Armagh, my own Archbishop, by the doctors, because his consultant here in the States likewise testified in his case that this had no medical or scientific explanation. It was impossible for him to have been healed as he was, completely healed, and didn't require any pain medication or anything from that instant.
Now, while we're in 1999, why don't you tell the people about the marking of the foreheads? Didn't that start in July of 1999 at the House of Prayer?
Well, yes, well, that refers to the gift of the seal.
Right.
Yeah. Well, our Blessed Mother told Christina that all those who would come to her house during that year beginning then, but who came with an open heart and with the right dispositions of soul. Christina understood that to have made a good confession and to be completely reconciled to God and to be in God's peace. That she would intercede that they would receive the gift mentioned in the Apocalypse. Now, Christina was very careful to stress that although that was the only place, the only physical place made known to her where that gift was actually being given, that those unable to go there because of illness or because of their condition, their situation, for example, enclosed religious or the Holy Father or whatever, that God would take care of such people irrespective of where they were. And she wasn't getting into all of that about, would it only be people who went there? But she was certainly made aware that that was part of the extraordinary gift of what the House of Prayer was bringing to people, and so on. And that was the gift of the seal.
I think now we should move into the House of Prayer, and like one of the many gifts is that our Blessed Virgin has said that she's always there praying with many angels.
Yes, when our Blessed Mother asked for a house of prayer, she said, I desire a little house of prayer for priests and people. I myself will be present in that house with many angels interceding for my children. Christina went to the Archbishop, and he said, but how could you get a house of prayer like that? And Christina had already felt helpless before Our Blessed Lady and had asked her, and Our Blessed Mother had said, your spiritual director will speak of it, and the people will respond. And so it happened. And she said to the Archbishop that she couldn't bring it about, but if Our Blessed Mother asked for it, that she must be going to bring it about. And so the people did respond, and they made it possible to acquire this former convent which was being sold. And Christina then returned to the Archbishop, and she asked him if he would grant permission for this house of prayer in his diocese, and would he bless it. And he said, I will not only give permission, I myself would personally open it and dedicate it. And I'll do so on a feast of Our Blessed Lady for you. And he was very helpful to Christina in that respect. And she understood that he was doing it so that it would be an oasis of peace and prayer, as Our Lady had desired, and that Christina would protect it so that it would be a place where she would pray with people who would come, and especially the sick, and she would engage her ministry there. And that's how it went. So it became very clear after that that people were being miraculously healed, and people were receiving conversion. Many people who had been away 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, even whole families from the sacraments were returning. And it was clear that very special graces of conversion were being abundantly bestowed by heaven, that Our Lady was accomplishing this, and the physical healings, and her ministry to priests was proving very special, because the gift I referred to earlier of knowing, always knowing in relation to a priest or religious, their spiritual life, their inner struggles, their state before God, and generally also in relation to lay people as well. That meant that Christina was much sought out by priests from all over the world. People were traveling from countless countries. There is a record there in the House of Prayer of all the countries from which people came to visit there, to pray and to meet her. But there was put in place then a little community, and this community were responsible at Christina's direction for the prayer schedule at the House of Prayer. And then Christina, of course, as time went on, she was shown, for example, in 1995, the weather changes that would come to the world. Words were mentioned by Our Lady that had never been heard before in common parlance in Ireland. Flooding, yes, but mudslides she spoke of, tornadoes in unexpected places, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions in places unaccustomed to them. And it became clear that Our Lady was desiring to protect us through fulfilling her message of prayer as she had made it originally. But Our Lady then asked, about 4 years ago, she asked for a chain of houses in union with her house in Achill in Ireland throughout the world. And she made a threefold promise in their regard. She didn't promise that all the gifts bestowed at the House of Prayer, the Mother House in Ireland, would pertain, but she gave a threefold promise for each house that would come about in her chain of houses, united with the mother house. She said she would be present in those houses also with her angels, that at the appointed time of God, healings would take place within the houses that would form the chain, and that protection would be given. And Christina understood the protection to apply not just to those within the houses, but also to the surrounding areas in which the houses would be located. She also understood that the people who would help to bring about those houses in her chain, even though they themselves mightn't live adjacent to the houses, but even possibly very far away, but if they worked or made sacrifices or contributed to bring about what Our Lady was offering for the protection of people, that they would enjoy that protection themselves, even though they wouldn't be living in the house or even be living in the neighborhood of the house.
One thing, and I'll put this in the beginning on the house, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the remodeling of the house and how that, like you say, everything ties together. I mean, nothing is like just happening.
That's right.
And as we're remodeling the church, if you discuss
yes.
that a little bit.
Yes, that was, on the one hand, it was a great shock to Christina, but on the other hand, it was a consolation too. After this former convent was acquired in Ireland, which is now the House of Prayer, volunteer workers were helping around the house, and Christina, of course, was guiding and carrying the main burden of refurbishment, of planning, and so on. But heaven was at work guiding her throughout. But one day she walked into the house and she went to a number of places in different rooms which looked exactly like the rest of the house. And people were very puzzled because Christina said, this needs to be demolished. This needs to be stripped away and replaced. And they couldn't understand what she meant. And Christina herself later said she was led there, she was guided, that of herself she couldn't humanly have known this, but she was made aware that beneath the surface there was corruption in these places. And it emerged that in each of those spots, when they did tear away the surface, they discovered that there was a horrible, in fact it's available on film, there's a film about the history of the House of Prayer, and it shows close-up pictures of those spots, and they were quite enlarged. Inwardly there was dampness, which was giving rise to all kinds of mildew and seepage and blistering on the walls, that was, and so on. But there was also found to be in the rafters of the roof dry rot, and it ended up that the entire roof had to be removed, as well as much of the walls stripped down. Now, when this was at its worst, it was like a shell, and Christina that was one of the times when she was tempted to lose heart. I'm sure the evil one was very busy trying to destroy her confidence, and she got frightened, and she thought, oh, here is this gone building all stripped down to a shell. This can never be put back together again. And she lost heart. She didn't think she could do that. And it was at that time that St. Patrick spoke to her. It was actually, I think, the 9th of December 1992. And when St. Patrick appeared to her, he was very fatherly and he was very consoling to her. But he said, this little house is a symbol of the whole church. The church itself must be stripped to its foundations. The gates of hell, however, will not prevail against it. And then he made Christina aware that there was hidden corruption in the church itself that would have to come out into the open to be removed. And that was long before the whole paedophilia scandals came to be known. And in fact, Christina was aware later that if everyone had responded humbly to Our Lady's initial call, that God would have purified the church and protected the young people at risk through paedophilia in a different way. But there would not have been the exposure that resulted in much scandal of people. God would have purified it, but in a different way. However, because so many in the church were not humble enough to accept Our Blessed Lady and to respond to her call, it had to be like this. And so the direct connection was clear between the struggle to renew the house as a material entity, as a physical building. And Christina was aware that every suffering and every trial she had to endure in putting the house right was received by God for the benefit of the church, globally speaking, throughout the world as a whole. It was at that time that she was made aware man begins at the bottom and works upwards. God begins at the top and works downwards. And she was made aware that this purification at higher levels in the church, bishops and priests and so on, that would work downwards, and then there would be the events that would take place throughout the world in the form of disasters and wars, which would be a general purification.
Now, has Christina been told anything about the warning?
Oh yes, she has. She's not only been told, as she was from the beginning, that there would come a time, I remember her saying, when people would be aware of God. And then very recently, she was shown the warning. She was made aware that it is extremely close, and she was given a lot of detail concerning it. For example, she was told directly in a message by Our Blessed Lady, and as Our Lady spoke to her, she showed her the occurrence as it will happen, but Christina was spared the distress and the fright and any terror that will accompany it for some people. But Our Lady said to her, there will be a day which will begin very dark and overcast, and people will think that it's nothing abnormal, but Our Lady said it will be abnormal. And she said, as the day goes on, at 4 in the afternoon, Christina's time, our time, Irish time, from 4 until 8 in the evening, it will go black, dark, and people on television, in the media, will be saying that soon there will be some explanation of this. The scientists will be able to give us some explanation, even though Our Lady says there will not be any explanation. And she said some will think maybe it's an eclipse, but it won't be an eclipse, she said. And then Christina was told by our Blessed Mother, and she experienced it as Our Lady spoke, that there would be light and fire would explode, and that some people would die as they beheld this, and people would be aware of their nothingness without God. That was the way it was expressed to Christina, that each person will be aware of his or her nothingness without God. In other words, their total dependence on God. And Our Lady then said that when this has taken place, many will seek out Christina to learn more about the experiences given to her and her apparitions.
Okay. The only time frame was just that it's soon. Was there any reference, like maybe a period of, like a season,
There was.
fall or winter?
There was actually, yes. She was aware that it would be the month of February.
Okay. I remember in a book she talked about a test for John Paul II. Do you know anything about that, and along with that, did she talk to John Paul at all? Did they did she write him letters that he received or anything?
Yes, she did. She communicated with the Holy Father, and the Holy Father received her communication. The Holy Father was aware of her, and the Holy Father understood what was given to her perfectly. And Christina knew, that if the Holy Father could only receive what she had received in infused knowledge, that because of his own mystical gifts, he would perfectly recognize that this was from God. And that in fact happened. She knows that happened. She was actually shown once by Our Lady when she asked her Holy Mother, will I ever meet the Holy Father? Not because she particularly wanted to meet him herself, but because Our Lady always spoke so tenderly and so specially of Pope John Paul II. Christina was actually told by our Blessed Mother that he was the greatest Pope ever given to the Church, and that he lived every day in the light and truth and grace of God, that he never offended God, that he lived in this grace of God, and that at each point in his increased sufferings, Christina was made aware by our Blessed Mother of what he was enduring, and Christina received much knowledge about the endurance of the Holy Father in the Vatican and about his pontificate, which she naturally wasn't free to disclose to the world. But when she asked Our Lady, will I ever meet him, it was a yearning of her because she knew he would understand when other people wouldn't. Right. And our Blessed Mother instantly showed Christina herself in front of the Holy Father, sitting on his papal chair, and she remarked to me at the time, it was strange because she said he looked so young and healthy. She couldn't grasp this. And our Blessed Mother didn't say yes or no, but showed this occurring. So when the Holy Father grew very fragile and very feeble, and as he approached death, it became humanly obvious that Christina, she couldn't possibly ever meet him now, and she wouldn't be able to meet him as Our Lady had showed her. And that was the one thing that wasn't fulfilled. And she said to me, I can't understand, why did Our Lady show me that happening and it hasn't occurred? And at 7 a.m. on the morning after he died, Pope John Paul II appeared to Christina, and he was exactly as Our Lady had shown him before. and he was much younger, and he was radiating light. He was so happy, joyous, and the position in which he was seated was exactly as Christina had been shown years before. And she was with him, because when it was shown previously, Christina said to me, "There's one thing I can't grasp about this. She never would go anywhere without her spiritual director, not only because she's nervous of flying, but she would never have gone to Rome to meet the Pope if I weren't with her, because, well, for many reasons, she just would feel more secure and,
Right.
so on." So she said, "And yet I was in front of the Holy Father, but you weren't there, you see." So when the apparition on the morning after he died was given to Christina, it was just Christina and the Holy Father. I wasn't present. So she could see then why Our Lady had shown her this, but also why Our Lady had not said yes or no. She just showed her what would happen. And the fact that in the very beginning Christina had been asked by Our Lady to give the message that we should pray the Our Father 7 times and many times for Pope John Paul II, because he was in many forms of danger, and she made Christina aware of what these dangers were. Pope John Paul II was very closely united with Christina's mission in that sense. As well as being aware of it, much of the prayer for his protection was coming through the message given to the world by Christina. And but for whatever reason, he was permitted to appear to her in the morning after he died. He spoke to her about the future of the church and many other things, but she wasn't free to disclose those.
Okay. Now, since we're on the popes, does Christina know anything about the longevity of the Roman papacy? There's the prophecy of Malachi, which has been followed fairly well, with like John Paul being born on an eclipse, and the sun was with him, and then
She would have no connection with any such prophecies herself.
Other than what I'm saying is, does she have some other knowledge, any knowledge about that could be shared? I realize that she also...
No, nothing that can be shared.
Okay. Why don't you just tell people, it's a great story, what Christina was shown about the soul when it dies and the truth of the light?
Yeah, at the moment of death, Christina was shown exactly what takes place. The soul becomes aware of what the body has confined it to and condemned it to, and at the moment of death, as the soul leaves the body, it moves towards the light of God, and it's in this light of God that the soul perceives itself. It's not as if God condemns a soul to hell or God sends a soul to purgatory. As the soul enters the light, the soul is aware of what the body has condemned it to, so it doesn't contest truth. It actually enters into the reality of truth, and the soul then plunges itself into whatever level of purgatory is required for its full purification, and is grateful to God for the gift of purgatory, because it knows that that is the only way in which it can achieve full purification, which will lead to direct union with God in the light of heaven. And a soul that has already condemned itself to hell will go to hell directly, because the light is more painful to a soul in darkness. It couldn't bear the light. So God is not to be blamed for anything. We take the consequences of our own lives at the moment of judgment and death.
And then there was the communion, or at least once, with the Archangel Michael. Wasn't there at the House of Prayer?
Yes, there was. Christina also received Holy Communion on other occasions when it subsequently became flesh in her mouth, and on another occasion actual blood in her mouth, and she got a little bit apprehensive on both those occasions for fear she mightn't be able to swallow the flesh or swallow the blood, because the taste of blood is not pleasant, and yet everything was protected and everything was fine.
And all of those were from the Archangel Michael?
No, when she received the host that became flesh and the host that became blood, she had received in the normal way of receiving Holy Communion from a priest at Mass.
Okay. Now, was that before they removed? Was that a Mass at the House of Prayer or at the local church there?
In whatever church she happened to be.
Oh, okay. Why don't you just get into it just for a little bit, why the Blessed Sacrament was moved out of the House of Prayer? Because they used to be able to say Mass right there, didn't you, in the beginning?
Yes, well, they just, for some years, yes, all the sacraments were there, and then the local church wanted to amalgamate and unite more closely with the parish, the House of Prayer. So the prayers all continued in the House of Prayer. Everything went on there as before in terms of the daily schedule of prayer and meeting with Christina, and especially the sick, and especially after so many miraculous healings of the sick had occurred, they all wanted to Christina to pray with them and so on. And then the local church, which is just a few yards away, right, the Mass and sacraments were available there.
Okay. Now, have you, I know in a lot, like there was here in the United States after 9/11, there was a rise in attendance at all churches, and also I've noticed in my parish at the end of the 90s, there was the Y2K thing and all that stuff, and there seemed to be more people, and now, and as I travel around, it seems like things are beginning to fade away from the millennial thing. Seemed to be, people were a little more on edge, and I know there's less attendance. It's gone down there.
Well, Our Lady has spoken about the weakening of faith, even of those who had believed,
right,
and that is definitely true. And it just shows, I suppose, how fickle people can be, that they're moved sometimes maybe by sensation, or they're not really living the message, because if they were living the basic message of Our Lady, which, as I said earlier, is the sacraments, is the teaching of the Church, is the rosary from the heart, and keeping to God's commandments, they would have inner peace. God would be at the heart of their devotion, and they would love God and His Mother, and they wouldn't be seeking sensation or thinking of the millennium or tying themselves to dates or seasons. Their conversion would be wholehearted and genuine, and Our Lady has said there is no place in God for sensation. So our Blessed Mother had spoken to Christina even about some people who would have come to the House of Prayer, the House of Prayer in Ireland, and how they would be plucked like weeds from her garden, because they would be such people, and all around. But we shouldn't judge either, we should just pray for them.
Well, no, that's all we can do, and I think there's a good story of that in Ezekiel. God tells Ezekiel basically the same thing. One thing I was interested in, has Christina, has she been given any insight into the story about the two witnesses from the 11th chapter?
Yes, she was, yes.
Is there anything we could...
Well, she was given insight about it, but I think it wasn't something to be publicized.
Okay. Yeah. But I had to ask. Didn't you?
That's good, that's right.
Then, I know when I was there the last time, and I believe we were talking earlier about the tsunami, and I think you mentioned already, I believe, the story of the larger rift and how it was going to get sucked under. Has there been anything current that you'd like to say, or anything else like within the last, since last summer, or that we haven't touched on in the last hour or
Well,
so?
there has been, but I would just like to begin in relation to the tsunami by saying that this was published in 1992 in her book, Out of the Ecstasy and Onto the Cross, where she had been shown the tsunami and the beaches and the palm trees and the wave rising and so on. Over 8 years ago, she was shown it again, and yet people, didn't seem to get concerned. And in January of this year, she was told that there would be other tsunamis, small at first, but becoming large. She was conscious on the very day of the actual tsunami in the Indian Ocean that as people rushed to the scene and tried to alleviate the terrible suffering caused, that was very commendable. But she was suffering all day for another reason as well, that she could hear the sound of the damage taking place on the ocean bed. And she couldn't explain this, how God could do this, but she could hear the noise of, she didn't even know the geographical terms of plates, tearing against each other. But she was aware, she could hear the noise, and she was aware of what it would bring about, that the damage beneath the surface was worse than what people were witnessing above the surface, and that this was creating a continued and increasing tension which would send a fault further out into the ocean, and that would generate an even greater tsunami in time to come, and that it would have its effects from Madagascar. She didn't know the island, but she said, I can see an island not far from the coast of Africa, and she said it will be completely lost, it will disappear, and the coastlines will be affected too.
And then one thing that I mentioned earlier, and I don't know if you want to talk about it at all or not, was she had mentioned an Antichrist in the church coming up?
Well, actually, yeah, she didn't put it like that. What she said was, she was shown the Antichrist, I know that, and she said that if she were to see him in reality or on television, she would instantly recognize him as the Antichrist. She has heard his voice too in another message. She was permitted to hear his tauntings, but she didn't go into anything specific about his being within the church. She just did say she would recognize him if she saw him again. She thought.
And has she seen him yet in
No,
the public realm?
No, she's not seen him in the public.
Okay. And then, and one thing I think to emphasize, I know you've mentioned it, all the people that, like sensationalize things and stuff. And I've dealt with that, people, putting down Christina, and I just say her bottom line doesn't change. It's like you've said, it's just prayer, the sacraments. That doesn't change. At the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, that's really what the message is.
No, and I would just like to say that in relation to people who might very glibly criticize the content of the message that relates to calamity and disaster, and war, by the way, because she was shown not only the war in Chechnya, which I mentioned, but also in Rwanda in Africa before it occurred, a year before it happened. But it's all right for someone to come along and say, oh, that message contains doom and gloom. But I would make two observations about that. First of all, anything Christina Gallagher has ever been given has happened. In other words, the proof of the pudding is the eating of it. And that is the big criterion which is cited in the Old Testament, in the scriptures. If someone prophesies, the mark of a true prophet is if what they says comes to pass. And that has always been the case with Christina. There have been other situations in which people might have said something, then it doesn't happen, and then they say, oh, maybe prayer prevented it. But she never says anything that doesn't come to pass. Now, the second thing I would say is this: since people now see and realize that she is upheld in the event, be it the Twin Towers, be it the tsunami, be it Chechnya, Rwanda, be it the tornadoes, the mudslides, the earthquakes, the flooding, and so on. If that isn't enough for people, well then go back to St. Matthew's Gospel, and there we find Jesus himself speaking about wars, about natural calamities and disasters in nature. If Jesus Christ, the Son of God, speaks in the Gospel, according to St. Matthew, about nations being in turmoil, about the heaving of the sea, is Jesus speaking doom and gloom? Jesus is speaking reality. Christina Gallagher speaks nothing different to what Jesus Christ speaks in his Gospel.
Now, while we're talking about that, I thought of something, and it was brought up like in the book of Jonah. Does Christina, and it's one thing I've never heard talked about, has she ever said that, talked about the mitigation of some things? Well, you did mention it in relation to the sex scandal, that it could have been held differently. Is she, I know in the overall thing she said...
Yes, the whole message from the very beginning was of mitigation. Our Blessed Lady had come first as Queen of Peace. She had summoned us to the sacraments. To go to confession was to be purified. There would be no purification of the world required if people allowed God to purify them through humble contrition, repentance, and confession. And it was only as people failed to take Our Lady seriously and to permit Our Lady to intervene to the full degree that she desired, that the events then were inevitable. They were not inevitable in the beginning. And that was very, very clear. And even in relation to the calamities and the disasters, in the very beginning Our Lady had desired, for example, to protect Ireland completely. And she waited for the Irish people to be a light to the rest of the world and to make choices which were to come their way in the ensuing years. And various referenda were put to the people of Ireland exactly as Our Lady had said beforehand, and they related to surrendering literally the soul of Ireland to the ways of the world. Out the window went so much that had been protected in Irish law, for example, abortion and all that pertains to the natural law, which is enshrined in the commandments of God. And the Irish people had a choice each time between greater liberalism and money, and so-called progress, and material development and advantage, but always at the price of her soul. And so our Blessed Mother never removed the freedom of the people, but she kept inviting and urging them to respond. And had they lived the message, she made it very clear that through prayer of the Rosary from the heart, to the degree that she desired, they could have obtained the gift of the Holy Spirit to enlighten them, Christina was aware, in the choices that would be put before them to seduce them.
And I thought of one thing when you were talking about the darkness. Sister Faustina talks about the cross coming up in the sky, and then light coming from the three areas where the wounds are. Was Christina shown that too, or?
Well, what she was shown actually the figure of Jesus in the sky, but she noticed that from his wounds, the place of the wounds, radiated brilliant light.
Right, so that was basically the same thing as Faustina. Okay, well, Father, it's always good to hear you. I hope everyone takes heart to your message, because it's like you say, it doesn't get any more real. Christina's been shown, what was like 500 miracles, isn't there, at the House of Prayer? And I don't know if there's anything you want to add. Feel free.
Well, just of course, it's Our Lady's message, and God is upholding it, but it's up to the people for their protection. God bless.
Good to talk to you. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Tim Bernard. I was the interviewer of Father McGinnity, and I'd like to read for you a couple of the messages. The first one is from the Virgin Mary that was given to Christina Gallagher on June 23rd at Our Lady's House of Prayer in Texas. My dear children, I welcome you here today to my first chain house. In time, some of you will witness many signs and receive great graces and healings to conquer your doubtful hearts. You permit the spirit of darkness to seduce you into much deception and doubt. This country will soon suffer much. Its birth pangs have begun. You, my children, remind me of the parable in the Book of Truth, the wise and foolish virgins. Many have become like the foolish virgins. I call you, but your hearts and your ears do not hear or respond. The hearts that were open, but weak, have fallen and drawn tears from my motherly heart. I can only love you, but you draw much upon yourselves. God has chosen this house and sent to you his messenger of peace. You close your hearts to the truth and how God has upheld her to the world in truth. Only the deceiver can deny that. Through your response, you draw life from her little by little. Her crosses have been many, as have her tears. My dear son Jesus bears great love for her through the cross and in the saving of many souls. My children, learn to surrender and open your hearts to receive the many graces God desires to give you. Turn away from darkness that leads you away and apart from God. I desire you to be mindful of the greatness and love God offers you. I beg you respond, and help my children of this house. Let it be put in order for the salvation of many souls. God desires to protect you in soul and body. It is your choice. My children, be mindful of those who will come to my house dressed in lamb's clothing, but their hearts are full of darkness. In my house there is no place for foul mouth or evil gossip. Oh, how I weep to look upon you and see how fast you fall in seduction of the evil one, through gossip or lies to divide and conquer. It draws tears from my heart. My children, I beg you, open your hearts to truth and make haste to put this house in order. I desire it to be completed and made fitting for your Lord who loves you. You have nothing that you can offer him but that which he has already given you. How foolish you can be to think anything you have is of yourself. Those of you, my children, who desire to remain in closed hearts, I cannot help you, and you will have much to suffer. I can only invite you, because I am your mother of soul, and I can only love you. I am with you here today in God's desire to impart to you my blessings, love, and graces, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Christina also received a message on the 23rd of June from Jesus. My little one, I bless you for your response to be here at my mother's house. My sacred heart rejoices with my little ones of my heart. How I will reward all who have tried so hard to respond and to have all ready for this special day of grace, and that many souls I will draw to myself for eternity. Woe to those who made themselves busy doing the work of Antichrist. He is on earth and desires to devour you. How unprepared you are. You permit yourselves to be caught in his web. For those who disbelieve, my little one of truth, Christina, whom I have upheld before the world, I have done great things only for you to witness the fruitfulness of my sacred heart through her. It is given by me for you to believe. Many bad things are coming to this country. If you desire to busy yourselves in falsity, then you will reap its reward. The houses of prayer have been played with as if it were fun, and not a call from me through my mother for your protection and the saving of souls. You will not mock me for long. I bless you in the desire of my sacred heart, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There were a couple of events that Christina spoke about during some question and answer sessions that took place at the house of prayer. One was why, after the end of this year, no more houses of prayer will be allowed to be built. And she answered, because God is going to step back then and allow the Antichrist to come forward. That does not mean that he will immediately become public, but he will stop restraining him, and he will begin to come to power. And we will see this unfold as we will see many things unfold. Another event that will be coming in the not too distant future is the collapse of the stock market. This has not only been foretold by many people who just study economics, but Christina has been shown that this will happen. So I'd recommend that you get prepared, for tough times are coming sooner rather than later. And there is something that we can all do, because Christina's message is very simple. It is to come to God, because it's not her message. It's what God's message has always been, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. If my people will come back to me and be my children, I will be their God. If they will humble themselves and ask for forgiveness, I will give forgiveness. For our God is a God of mercy and love. His mercy is endless, and His love is unimaginable for us. But we do have to do something. We have to change our lives. As you heard Father McGinnity talk about the warning, we need to prepare ourselves for the warning, because it's real and it's coming, and things will become more and more heightened. It will not be easier to change, but it will be harder to change. Start now. A very simple way, if you do not have a prayer life, is to simply say 3 Hail Marys. If you are not a Catholic maybe, and you have a problem with that, well, why don't you say 3 Our Fathers? For that is what our Lord Jesus Christ said upon the cross. And that comes from Anne Catherick Emmerich, one of the greatest visionaries to ever live. So please pray, change your life, come to God. Following this, there will be some phone numbers and some addresses where you can call if you feel God pulling you to help Christina with the House of Prayer. Feel free to call for more information to get involved. Right now they're currently trying to finish up the house in Texas. There are a couple others underway at various stages in Ohio and Kansas. But they're focusing right now on the house in Texas, the first one, and to get it completely done. So I urge you, if you are feeling a call from God, to pray about it. And if there's something you can do, to contact the House of Prayer in Texas and ask for more information as to how you may be able to help. Thank you. One thing I'd like to mention is that Father McGinnity, when speaking about the warning, mentioned February. That wasn't necessarily February 2007, though it could be. It could also be 2008, 2010, just that it would be in February. If you wish to visit the House of Prayer, it is located at 23700 Nameless Road in Leander, Texas. If you don't know how to get there, just give them a phone call. The phone number is listed on the screen. If you'd like to send a fax, send it to the number that is listed on the screen. Or you can send mail to the House of Prayer, Box 1839, Cedar Park, Texas, 78613. And remember, this tape is copyrighted, but if you wish to make copies for your friends and family, you are more than welcome to please spread the message. Thank you very much, and peace be with you.